In the spring of 1943, on a farm in Wisconsin, 19-year-old Eugene Moran was still young enough that his hands remembered the weight of a shovel better than the weight of a machine gun. He had grown up in the long shadow of the Great Depression, where survival meant early mornings, frozen fields, and work that never really ended. The rhythm of his life was measured in seasons: planting, harvest, winter, repeat. War was something that existed in newspaper headlines and crackling radio broadcasts drifting across kitchen tables. But by the time he turned 19, the war had come looking for boys exactly like him. America had been fighting for less than 2 years, and the air war over Europe was turning into something brutal and mathematical. Factories in Germany had to be destroyed, oil had to be burned, shipyards had to be shattered. The United States Air Forces believed in daylight precision bombing, tight formations of heavy bombers flying high enough to be out of reach, armed heavily enough to defend themselves. The backbone of that strategy was the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress. The B-17 was not graceful, it was not fast, but it was built to absorb punishment. 4 engines, aluminum skin, a wingspan wider than most houses were long, bristling with .50 caliber machine guns. It carried 10 men: pilot, co-pilot, navigator, bombardier, radio operator, engineer, waist gunners, ball turret gunner, and, in the most isolated position of all, the tail gunner. The tail gunner had one job: protect the formation from attacks coming straight from behind. German fighter pilots preferred that angle. It offered the largest target and the most lethal approach. From that narrow glass enclosure at the very rear of the aircraft, the tail gunner could see everything closing in, every Messerschmitt lining up for a kill. It was one of the most dangerous positions in the entire bomber. Training was fast. The war did not wait. Young men like Moran learned to fire twin Browning .50 caliber machine guns at moving targets, to judge speed and distance in seconds, to function in temperatures that could drop below -40 degrees at altitude. At 24,000 feet, exposed metal could freeze skin instantly. Oxygen masks were not optional, they were survival equipment. Frostbite, hypoxia, and flak were constant threats. In 1943, the average life expectancy of a bomber crewman flying over Germany was measured not in years, but in missions. Eugene Moran was assigned to a B-17F known as Rikki-Tikki-Tavi, part of the 8th Air Force based in England. The name was painted near the nose, inspired by the brave mongoose from Rudyard Kipling's story, a small creature that fought cobras without hesitation. The irony would come later. By November 1943, the air campaign had intensified. The target lists grew more ambitious. Bremen, Germany, was one of them, a heavily defended industrial city with shipyards, factories, and submarine construction facilities vital to the German war effort. It was also wrapped in anti-aircraft batteries and protected by experienced Luftwaffe fighter units. The mission on November 29th was not unusual on paper. Bombers would take off from cold English airfields, climb in slow spirals to altitude, form up in tight combat boxes, and cross the North Sea toward Germany. Discipline in formation was everything. A lone bomber was a dead bomber. The guns overlapped. The firepower depended on unity. At altitude, the sky could look deceptively peaceful: bright sunlight above the clouds, engines droning steadily, condensation trails streaking white behind wings. But over targets like Bremen, the calm never lasted. German radar detected incoming formations long before they arrived. Anti-aircraft crews prepared their 88mm guns.
Fighters fueled and waited for vector instructions. The Americans called the black bursts of exploding flak ack. The Germans had perfected it. Shells were timed to detonate at bomber altitude, filling the sky with steel fragments that tore through aluminum and flesh alike. For a tail gunner, the view was both beautiful and terrifying. From the rear enclosure, Moran would have watched the formation stretching ahead, dozens of bombers, sunlight flashing off wings, and beyond them, dark puffs of flak blooming closer and closer. He would also have known something else, something every crewman understood by late 1943. Bombers were not invincible. Earlier that year, missions like Schweinfurt and Regensburg had proven how vulnerable unescorted bombers could be deep over Germany. Losses had been staggering. Entire crews vanished in minutes. Survivors spoke of aircraft simply disappearing in explosions or spirals of flame. And yet, the missions continued. Because at 19, when you were handed a headset, an oxygen mask, and a pair of loaded machine guns, you do not think in terms of statistics. You think in terms of today's flight, today's formation, today's job. For Eugene Moran, that job meant crawling into the very back of Rikki-Tikki-Tavi, sealing himself inside a plexiglass compartment barely large enough to move, surrounded by ammunition belts and two heavy Brownings pointed at the sky behind him. There was no easy escape route from the tail, no quick way forward if something went wrong. In an emergency, survival depended on seconds and luck. The engines would have roared during takeoff, vibrating through the airframe. The English coastline would have slipped away beneath them. Gradually, the aircraft climbed, the temperature dropping, breath turning thin even with oxygen. Ice could form on the guns, controls stiffened in the cold. Then came the long approach to enemy territory. Ahead lay Bremen. What none of them could know that morning was that within hours, 8 of the 10 men aboard would be dead, that the aircraft would not simply be shot down, it would be torn apart, and that the 19-year-old farm boy from Wisconsin, sitting alone at the very end of the airplane, would face a moment so violent and so improbable that it would defy everything they had been taught about survival. At 24,000 feet above Germany, physics, gravity, and war were about to converge in a way almost no one had ever survived. And Eugene Moran would not stop firing.
November 29, 1943, began in darkness. On the airfields of eastern England, floodlights cut through the cold morning mist as ground crews moved between rows of B-17s, checking engines, loading ammunition, topping off fuel tanks that would have to carry each aircraft hundreds of miles into hostile territory and back. Frost clung to metal surfaces. Breath hung white in the air. Inside briefing rooms, crews sat shoulder to shoulder on wooden benches, waiting for the curtain to be pulled back from the day's target map. When the cloth dropped and the red yarn line stretched across the North Sea toward Bremen, there would have been no cheers. Bremen meant flak. It meant fighters. It meant one of the most heavily defended industrial centers in northern Germany, home to shipyards, aircraft production, and vital submarine facilities. By late 1943, the Germans had layered the city in anti-aircraft batteries calibrated to reach American bombing altitude with terrifying precision. Eugene Moran and the crew of the B-17F Rikki-Tikki-Tavi absorbed the details the way bomber crews were trained to do. Altitude, assembly time, expected fighter opposition, rally points. The numbers were clinical. The reality was not. After briefing came the ritual: coffee, jokes that weren't especially funny, the quiet writing of letters that might never be mailed. Then heavy flight gear, electrically heated suits, flak vests, parachute harnesses. The walk across the hard stand toward their aircraft. A B-17 on the ground looked massive. Inside, it felt narrow and fragile. Aluminum skin only millimeters thick separated the crew from the sky. Moran would have made his way through the fuselage to the very rear, past the waist gun positions, stepping carefully over structural supports and equipment until he reached the tail compartment. His world for the next several hours would be a cramped enclosure of plexiglass and metal, twin 50 caliber Brownings mounted in front of him, ammunition belts coiled at his sides. Takeoff was always heavy. Fully loaded with fuel and bombs, the B-17 needed a long runway and steady nerves. Engines thundered, the aircraft shuddered, then gradually it lifted into the gray English sky. One by one, bombers circled and climbed, forming into tight combat boxes. Discipline in formation flying was not optional. The overlapping fields of fire from each aircraft created a defensive web. Break that web, fall behind, and you became a magnet for German fighters. By the time the formation crossed the North Sea and approached the European coastline, they were climbing toward 24,000 feet. At that altitude, the temperature could plunge to -40 degrees. Oxygen masks were locked in place. Without supplemental oxygen, a man could lose consciousness in minutes. Frost formed along interior surfaces. The slipstream outside the tail position roared constantly, a reminder that nothing separated Moran from open air except thin panels and rivets. As they neared Bremen, the first black bursts appeared. Flak did not explode randomly. German anti-aircraft crews used radar and optical tracking to calculate altitude and speed. Shells were fused to detonate directly in the path of incoming bombers. When they burst, they scattered jagged steel fragments in all directions. A near miss could shred control cables, puncture fuel tanks, or tear through crewmen. From the tail, Moran would have watched the sky darken with those explosions, puffs of black smoke blossoming at eye level, some close enough to rock the aircraft. The smell of cordite and hot metal drifting through ventilation gaps. Over the intercom, clipped voices, pilots correcting formation spacing, navigators confirming headings. Then came the fighters. German interceptors, Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf FW-190s climbed to meet the formation. By late 1943, many were armed not just with machine guns, but with 20mm and 30mm cannon, capable of tearing through a bomber's structure with a handful of hits. The preferred tactic was to attack from the rear or from head-on passes, exploiting blind spots and concentrating fire. For a tail gunner, the rear approach was personal. The first fighter lining up behind the formation would have appeared as a small silhouette growing rapidly larger. Closing speeds between bomber and fighter could exceed 500 miles per hour. Moran had seconds to judge distance, lead the target, and fire. Twin .50 caliber Brownings thundered when triggered, each capable of firing hundreds of rounds per minute. Tracer rounds streaked outward, bright lines cutting through cold air. Combat at altitude was chaotic. Bombers held formation while fighters darted in and out. Explosions flashed, engines caught fire. Parachutes sometimes blossomed far below, small white flowers drifting toward enemy territory. At some point over Bremen, Rikki-Tikki-Tavi began to fall behind. It did not take much. A damaged engine, control surfaces compromised by flak, a momentary loss of speed. In a tight formation, even a slight lag could open a gap, and once separated, a bomber became isolated prey. German fighters noticed immediately. They concentrated on the straggler. Cannon shells slammed into aluminum skin. The sound inside the aircraft would have been deafening, metal tearing, impacts hammering through the frame. A single 20mm round could punch through armor, through equipment, through men. One by one, crew positions went silent. Inside the fuselage, chaos replaced coordination. Intercom calls unanswered, smoke creeping along the ceiling, hydraulic fluid misting into the air. Somewhere forward, critical structural members were being weakened with every hit.
The B-17 had a reputation for durability. Many limped home with holes large enough to crawl through, but there were limits. Another pass, more cannon fire. The aircraft shuddered violently. At 24,000 feet above Germany, something catastrophic happened. Whether it was a structural spar severed by flak or cannon shells detonating within the fuselage, the effect was immediate and devastating. The bomber did not simply lose altitude, it came apart. The fuselage split. In an instant measured in fractions of a second, the front section containing the cockpit and most of the crew separated from the rear. Metal screamed as it tore, control cables snapped, the forward half of Rikki-Tikki-Tavi peeled away, falling into open sky. Eugene Moran was still in the tail. The world around him transformed from aircraft interior to exposed wreckage. The stable horizon vanished, the severed tail section, suddenly without the balancing mass of wings and engines, pitched and began to tumble. At 24,000 feet, there was no time to think in paragraphs, only fragments. The bomber was gone. The sky was below him, and gravity had taken hold.
When the B-17 broke apart, there was no clean transition from aircraft to freefall. There was violence. The moment the fuselage split, Eugene Moran was no longer a tail gunner in a formation over Bremen. He was a 19-year-old suspended inside a jagged piece of wreckage, suddenly detached from wings, engines, and the weight that had kept everything stable. The rear section did not glide, it did not descend smoothly, it pitched, rolled, and began to tumble through thin air at 24,000 feet. At that altitude, the air is cold enough to burn exposed skin, oxygen is scarce, the sky is enormous and indifferent. A human body falling from that height without a parachute has roughly 90 seconds before impact. Terminal velocity in a stable belly-to-earth position can exceed 120 miles per hour, but Moran was not in a stable position. He was inside a hollowed fragment of aircraft, twisted metal, torn control cables, shattered plexiglass, falling unpredictably. Somehow, he was still conscious. Cannon fire had already wounded him. Both arms were bleeding. Fragments of metal had ripped through the tail section when fighters made their final passes. His parachute, stored near his position, had been shredded by earlier hits. Even if he could have escaped the compartment, and escape from a tail section would have required impossible timing, the silk that might have saved him was no longer intact. Training manuals did not cover this scenario. Bomber crews were taught emergency bailout procedures. They were drilled on how to clip on parachutes, how to move toward exit points, how to clear the aircraft before pulling the ripcord, but no one trained for remaining inside a severed tail, detached from the rest of the bomber, spinning through the sky. The natural response would have been shock, paralysis, a desperate scramble for an exit that might not even exist. Instead, Moran reached for his guns. The twin .50 caliber Brownings were still mounted in front of him. Ammunition belts, though jostled violently, had not completely dislodged. Instinct and discipline overrode disbelief. The enemy fighters were still there. In the chaos of a bomber breaking apart, German pilots would circle to confirm the kill. A falling aircraft was considered destroyed. Survivors were rare. But from the perspective of those fighters, something impossible was happening. Tracers were still rising from the wreckage. As the tail section tumbled, Moran fired. The physics were brutal. A spinning object falling from high altitude does not maintain a steady firing platform. Every rotation altered his orientation. Sky, earth, sky again in dizzying succession. G-forces shifted unpredictably as the wreckage caught air, stalled, then pitched again. The slipstream tore at exposed metal. The noise must have been overwhelming, wind screaming through ruptured structure, loose panels vibrating, ammunition casings ejecting and vanishing into space. And yet he kept pressing the triggers. Why?
In combat psychology, there is a concept known as task fixation. Under extreme stress, some individuals narrow their focus to the one action they've been trained to perform. It becomes anchor and identity. For a tail gunner, that task was simple: defend the formation, shoot down attacking fighters, protect the aircraft, even if the aircraft no longer existed as it had seconds earlier. There is also the matter of time perception. In high adrenaline events, seconds can stretch into what feels like minutes. The brain floods the body with stress hormones. Pain can become distant. Peripheral awareness fades. The world reduces to the immediate threat. German pilots approaching the falling debris would not have expected resistance. A crippled bomber usually meant defenseless targets, parachutes, scattered wreckage, fire. Instead, they encountered muzzle flashes, bright tracer lines arcing unpredictably from a spinning tail. A .50 caliber round, even fired from an unstable platform, remained lethal. Closing speeds were still high. A fighter that misjudged distance could take hits before its pilot fully understood what he was seeing. Accounts from the war describe German pilots breaking away in confusion. No training prepared them for a gunner continuing to fight from a coffin of metal already plummeting toward Earth. Inside that coffin, Moran's situation was deteriorating by the second. Altitude was bleeding away rapidly. From 24,000 feet, the fall would have taken roughly 90 seconds, perhaps slightly longer if the irregular shape of the tail created drag. But drag can be a double-edged sword. It can slow descent slightly, yet it can also induce violent spinning. Every rotation risked slamming him against the interior structure. Every oscillation could have snapped weakened metal or torn loose whatever remained intact. Somewhere in that descent, the ground began to take shape. Fields, forests, buildings, Germany rising up to meet him. The mathematics of survival were merciless. A human body impacting solid ground at terminal velocity rarely survives. But Moran was not falling alone. He was inside a structure, a fragment of aircraft that still had ribs, spars, and skin. If that structure struck at a particular angle, if it absorbed part of the energy, if the terrain beneath offered even slight give, mud, plowed earth, soft ground, the physics changed. Marginally, improbably. He continued firing until he could no longer see fighters in his sights. Whether from ammunition depletion, loss of targets, or the overwhelming nearness of the earth, the gunfire eventually ceased, but not because he had surrendered. Gravity was about to decide the rest. In those final seconds, there would have been no formation ahead of him, no engines droning, no intercom voices, only wind, wreckage, blood on frozen gloves, and the rushing certainty that the fall was ending. 19 years old, 4 miles above enemy territory less than 2 minutes earlier, still fighting on the way down.
Impact from 24,000 feet is not a single event. It is a transfer of energy. By the time the severed tail section of Rikki-Tikki-Tavi neared the ground, it had been falling for well over a minute. Its speed was no longer increasing dramatically. Air resistance had imposed limits, but the mass of twisted aluminum, steel components, ammunition, and a wounded 19-year-old gunner still carried enormous kinetic force. Witnesses on the ground later described wreckage descending separately from the main body of the bomber. The forward section had already fallen miles away. Fires marked where it struck. The tail came down in a different location, tumbling until the last seconds. The angle of impact matters in physics. A flat, rigid strike transfers force almost instantly. A glancing or angled blow can redirect and distribute energy over fractions of a second longer, sometimes the difference between total destruction and partial survival. The tail section did not spear directly into concrete. It struck open ground near the village of Willstead, outside Bremen. The earth there was soft from late autumn moisture. Fields had been worked. The soil was not solid stone. When the tail hit, metal crumpled.
Structural ribs designed to withstand aerodynamic stress folded inward, plexiglass shattered. The compartment that had been Moran's world compressed violently. The shock would have been overwhelming, a sudden deceleration that slammed his body against harness and interior framing. In high-speed crashes, survival often depends on what absorbs the force first. In this case, the aircraft structure sacrificed itself. The tail did not remain intact. It collapsed, twisted, partially burying itself in the field, but it did not vaporize. And inside that wreckage, against every expectation, Eugene Moran was alive. He was not uninjured. His arms had already been torn by cannon fragments. The fall and impact added new trauma, bruising, shock, likely broken bones or internal injuries. Yet he had not been thrown clear at terminal velocity. He had not struck the ground unprotected. The broken aircraft around him had become, in a brutal twist of fate, a crude protective shell. German civilians were the first to reach the crash site. For them, American bombers were not distant objects in the sky. They were threats that brought destruction. Factories burned, homes were damaged, families lived under air raid sirens. When a bomber fell, curiosity and anger often drew people toward the wreckage. They expected bodies. Instead, they found movement. Accounts from the period describe Moran regaining consciousness inside the crushed tail section, disoriented, in pain, surrounded by torn metal and spent ammunition casings. The guns that had been firing less than 2 minutes earlier were now silent, bent at unnatural angles. German soldiers soon followed. Local defense units, possibly Luftwaffe personnel or Wehrmacht troops assigned to crash recovery, secured the site. Protocol required gathering intelligence, identifying crew, and capturing any survivors. When they pulled him from the wreckage, they reportedly could not believe he had fallen from such height. To them, as to anyone who understood the physics, survival seemed impossible. Yet here was a wounded American tail gunner, conscious enough to be taken prisoner. Hours earlier, he had been certain to die in midair. Now he was alive, but in enemy hands. Capture brought a different kind of uncertainty. Downed airmen in Germany were typically interrogated and then sent to prisoner-of-war camps such as Stalag Luft facilities designated for Allied aircrew. The Geneva Conventions offered some protections on paper, but treatment varied. Medical care depended on available resources and the condition of the prisoner. Moran required treatment. Shrapnel wounds, trauma from the crash, shock from extreme cold and blood loss, all had to be addressed. German medical personnel stabilized him. Whatever anger civilians may have felt, military authorities recognized the value of keeping captured airmen alive for intelligence and exchange purposes. The immediate chaos of combat was over. The sky battle had ended. The guns were silent. But survival did not mean safety. He had fallen 4 miles through freezing air inside a broken aircraft and lived. Now he faced captivity in a country still locked in total war, with nearly 17 months remaining before Germany would surrender. In the field near Bremen, the wreckage of the tail section lay twisted and half-buried, a monument to violence and improbable endurance. Investigators would later examine it, trying to understand how anyone inside could have survived such a descent. The answer was not simple luck alone. It was a chain of variables: altitude, drag, angle of fall, soil conditions, structural collapse absorbing energy. Remove one factor, and the outcome changes. But beyond physics was something harder to measure. From the moment the bomber split apart to the second the tail struck the ground, Eugene Moran had not surrendered to inevitability. Even in free fall, wounded and certain of death, he had continued to fight. Now, pulled from the wreckage by enemy hands, that fight entered a new phase, not against gravity or fighters in the sky, but against pain, imprisonment, and the long uncertainty of war. The fall was over. The survival story was not.
When Eugene Moran regained full awareness, the sky over Bremen was gone. The roar of engines had been replaced by the quiet routines of captivity. After emergency treatment for his wounds, he entered the system that processed downed Allied airmen. Interrogation came first. German intelligence officers questioned captured bomber crews for details about unit strength, aircraft capabilities, escort fighters, targets. Airmen were trained to give only name, rank, and serial number. Some interrogations were psychological rather than violent. Long conversations, attempts to exploit confusion, fatigue, or injury. Moran had fallen 4 miles inside a severed tail section and survived. Now he faced a different endurance test: time. He was eventually transferred to a Luftwaffe-run prisoner-of-war camp for Allied airmen. These camps, commonly known as Stalag Luft camps, held thousands of captured flyers. Conditions varied, but by late 1943 and into 1944, shortages were growing. Germany's resources were stretched thin. Food rations declined. Winters were harsh. Barracks were overcrowded. Yet there was also structure. Captured airmen created routines to preserve sanity. They organized lectures, language classes, improvised theater productions. They built exercise schedules to maintain strength. The goal was simple: resist mental collapse. In captivity, days could blur into one another. For young men who had lived at combat tempo, missions, briefings, adrenaline, the stillness was its own strain. Moran was 19 when his aircraft broke apart over Bremen. He would spend roughly 17 months as a prisoner before the war in Europe ended in May 1945. 17 months is long enough for seasons to turn twice, long enough to feel forgotten, long enough to wonder whether home still feels real. Meanwhile, the air war intensified. Allied bombing campaigns expanded. Long-range escort fighters like the P-51 Mustang began accompanying bombers deep into German territory, reducing losses that had once been catastrophic. Industrial targets were hammered repeatedly. Oil facilities were crippled. Transportation networks fractured. The strategic calculus that had sent Rikki-Tikki-Tavi over Bremen continued, larger and more relentless. Inside the camp, news filtered in slowly. Rumors spread quickly. D-Day landings in June 1944. Allied advances from the west. Soviet forces pushing from the east. Guards grew tenser as Germany's position weakened. By early 1945, many POW camps were evacuated ahead of Allied armies. Prisoners were forced on long marches in winter conditions, later known as the Long Marches, as German authorities attempted to move them away from front lines. Survival during these final months of war could depend on resilience as much as during combat. Malnutrition, exposure, illness, these were quieter threats than flak bursting at altitude, but persistent. Then, in the spring of 1945, the collapse accelerated. German resistance fragmented, supply chains broke down, guards sometimes fled. Allied ground forces reached camp after camp, liberating thousands of airmen who had once vanished into enemy territory. For Eugene Moran, liberation meant something almost impossible to comprehend. He had survived the fall, survived captivity, and now the war itself was ending. Statistically, his story was extraordinary. Falling from 24,000 feet without a functioning parachute is almost always fatal. During the entire Second World War, only a handful of airmen survived comparable high-altitude falls without full parachute deployment. Moran became one of only 3 known Allied airmen to live through such an event. But numbers cannot fully capture the human dimension. He had been a farm boy from Wisconsin,
a teenager assigned to one of the most exposed positions in a heavy bomber. On November 29, 1933, 8 of the 10 men aboard his aircraft were killed. The bomber split in half. Physics dictated an ending. Instead, there was impact and breath. After returning home, like many veterans of the air war, he did not become a headline name. There were no grand parades centered on the tail section that refused to surrender. The war had produced millions of stories, and many of them were overshadowed by larger battles, famous generals, decisive invasions. Yet within the quiet margins of history, his survival stands as a reminder of something profound. War often reduces individuals to statistics: sorties flown, tons of bombs dropped, percentages of casualties. But inside those numbers are singular moments where human will intersects with circumstance in ways that defy expectation. At 24,000 feet over Germany, gravity did not pause, metal did not soften, the ground did not move out of the way. What changed the outcome was a chain of variables: structural drag, angle of descent, soil conditions, and a young man who, even in freefall, continued to do his duty. He kept firing on the way down, not because it guaranteed survival, but because it was his job. And sometimes, in the narrow space between inevitability and impact, that refusal to stop can carry a man further than physics ever intended.